Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, a letter arrives from a lawyer you've never met. A distant uncle you barely remember has passed away, and the last line of his will read your name. He left you a storage unit on the edge of town. You push open the rusted iron door. Inside, $2 million in old, forgotten cash. And a leather-bound ledger, its first entry dated 1928. You are about to trace a secret that has waited nearly a century to be found. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the rhythm of the rain become the only sound. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. You remember that detail clearly, not because Tuesdays hold any particular significance, but because the rain had been falling since morning, steady and gray, the kind of November rain that makes the world feel smaller and quieter than it actually is. The gutters along your street were choked with wet leaves, and the sound of water running through the downspout outside your kitchen window had become a constant, gentle murmur, a sound you had stopped noticing hours ago, the way you stopped noticing the ticking of a clock in a room where you have lived a long time. The envelope was not like the others in your mailbox. It was heavier, for one thing, a thick, cream-colored paper that bore the weight of something official. The return address was printed in small, dignified letters, a law firm in Portland, Maine. You had never been to Portland. You knew no one there. And yet here was this envelope, addressed to you by name, with a certified mail sticker affixed to the corner as if to announce that whatever lay inside was important enough to require proof of delivery. You set the rest of the mail aside, bills, a catalog you hadn't asked for, a postcard from a friend who was somewhere warm, and sat down at the kitchen table. The chair creaked softly beneath you, a familiar sound. Outside, the rain continued its patient work against the window glass. You slid your thumb beneath the flap of the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead, folded once, and a smaller envelope. The letter was typed in a font that suggested tradition and probity. It began with the usual formalities, "Dear Sir or Madam, we regret to inform you," but the words that followed were anything but usual. A storage unit. Located in a town you had never visited, in a county whose name you had only ever seen on maps. It had been leased, the letter explained, for 50 years. Paid in full. In cash. The lease had recently expired. And now, by the curious Mackin. Area of property law and the absence of any other living claimant, the contents of that storage unit, whatever they might be, belonged to you. You read that sentence twice. The words did not change. Somewhere, in a place you had never been, there was a locked room that had been waiting for half a century. And you were the person it had been waiting for. The following afternoon, you found yourself standing in front of a gray office building in the older part of the city. The elevator was ancient. It groaned as it carried you up to the 7th floor, the fluorescent light inside flickering once before steadying. The corridor was lined with frosted glass doors, and the one you wanted was at the very end. A brass nameplate bore the same name as the letterhead. The lawyer was a tired-looking man in a dark suit that had been pressed one too many times. His desk was buried under stacks of files, and a cold cup of tea sat at his elbow, forgotten. He gestured for you to sit, then pulled a single sheet of paper from a drawer. The will. He read it aloud. Most of it was legal language you didn't follow. But when he reached the end, he paused. He removed his glasses, polished them slowly with the edge of his sleeve, and looked at you. "Your uncle lived alone," he said. "Kept to himself. We had some trouble locating next of kin." He set the glasses back on his nose. "In the end, you were the only one we could find." He reached into the drawer again. This time, he pulled out a small envelope, the kind used for keys. He didn't hand it to you immediately. He held it in his palm for a moment, as if weighing something, and then he placed it on the desk between you. Inside the envelope was a key. It was larger than an ordinary key, and heavier. Brass, tarnished with age, its surface worn smooth in places where fingers had held it. Attached to the handle by a small iron ring was a tag, rectangular, rusted at the edges, with a number stamped into the metal. You turned the tag over in your fingers, feeling the raised edges of the numbers. 1931, the year did not seem like a coincidence. It seemed like a clue, or perhaps a question, one that no one was left to answer. The lawyer watched you examine the key. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he removed his glasses again, set them down on the desk, and leaned forward slightly. "Your uncle used to go to that storage unit at night," he said. The neighbors noticed. He would sit inside for hours. Never turned the lights on, just brought a kerosene lamp. They thought he was a little strange. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice was quieter, less formal. "The contents, you may want to see for yourself." He did not elaborate. He did not offer any hints. He simply looked at you with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite curiosity, something gentler than both. You thanked him and stood. The key was still in your hand, growing warmer now against your skin. The iron tag pressed into your palm, and when you glanced down, you saw the faint impression it had left there. The numbers, reversed, printed lightly on your flesh. The year the Great Depression was at its worst. The year banks were failing and fortunes were vanishing overnight. And somewhere, in a storage unit on the edge of the city, something had been locked away. Something your uncle had thought was important enough to keep for more than half a century. You stepped out of the office and into the corridor. The fluorescent light overhead flickered once, then steadied. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, the pavement glistening under the street lamps as you made your way home. That night, you placed the key on your bedside table. It sat there in the dim light, the brass catching the faint glow from the window. You lay in bed for a long time, listening to the rain as it returned, softer now, a gentle murmur against the glass. The number on the tag seemed to watch you from across the room. A year. A code. A question. You picked the key up once more before you went to sleep. You held it up to the lamp on your desk, watching the light catch the worn edges of the brass, the deep groove of the notches. You wondered about the last time this key had turned in its lock. What year had that been? What hand had held it? And what, after 50 years of silence, was still waiting on the other side of that door? The weekend arrived quietly, the way weekends often do, without fanfare, without urgency, just a slow, gray morning that gave way to a pale afternoon. The key had been sitting on your bedside table for days. You had picked it up more times than you could count, turning it over in your fingers, tracing the worn edges of the brass, reading the number on the iron tag until it was burned into your memory. 1. Now, finally, you were going to use it. You drove through the city as the afternoon began to fade. The streets grew emptier the farther you went. Tall buildings gave way to low warehouses. Warehouses gave way to empty lots, and empty lots gave way to stretches of wild grass and gravel roads. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that hadn't yet decided whether to release their rain. You rolled down your window a few inches. The air that slipped in was cool and damp, carrying a faint smell of rust and wet earth and the distant, salty hint of the sea. The industrial district was not abandoned, exactly. It was more like a place that had been forgotten. The buildings still stood. The road still led somewhere. But the windows were dark, and the signs above the doors had faded into illegibility. Weeds grew through cracks in the pavement, tall and yellow and swaying gently in the breeze. In the distance, a smokestack rose against the sky, its top lost in the low-hanging clouds. A single gull wheeled overhead, its cry carrying across the empty lots before fading into silence. You found the storage unit at the end of a row of identical structures. It was larger than the others, its corrugated iron door facing the road like a closed eye. Rust had spread across the metal in patterns that looked almost intentional, swirling maps of orange and brown, layered one on top of another, as if the door had been weathering for a very long time indeed. Above the door, a faded metal plate was screwed into the wall. You brushed away a layer of grime with your thumb. The number BER was still legible. The same number as the tag on your key. You stood there for a moment, the key clutched in your hand. The wind had picked up, rustling through the dry weeds and making a low, hollow sound against the iron door. Somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of sheet metal tapped against a wall, a soft, irregular percussion. You took a breath. Then you crouched down and fitted the key into the heavy padlock that held the door shut. The lock was old and reluctant. You had to work the key back and forth, feeling the internal mechanisms resist and then, slowly, begin to yield. Finally, with a deep, resonant click that seemed to echo through the empty district, the lock sprang open. You removed it and set it aside. Then you gripped the bottom edge of the door with both hands and pulled upward. The door did not move smoothly. It fought you, grinding against its rusted tracks, screeching in protest as you forced it up inch by inch. Flakes of rust and dried paint showered down around you, catching the last gray light of the afternoon. The noise was tremendous, a shriek of metal on metal that scattered a flock of small birds from a nearby power line. But then, with one final heave, the door was up. Not all the way. Just high enough for you to duck underneath. You pulled a flashlight from your pocket and switched it on. The click of the button was sharp and precise in the silence. The beam cut through the darkness inside, and what it revealed made you stop. The storage unit was much deeper than you had expected. It stretched back into shadows so thick that the flashlight could not reach the far wall. But you could see enough. Enough to understand that the space was not empty. It was filled, packed, really, with parcels. Stack after stack of them, rising from the concrete floor toward the high ceiling. They were not boxes. They were not crates. They were bundles wrapped in brown craft paper, each one roughly the size of a pillow, tied tightly with coarse twine. The paper was yellowed and brittle with age. In some places, it had torn, revealing glimpses of something pale and fibrous inside. The bundles were stacked with extraordinary care, row upon row, layer upon layer, as if whoever had placed them there had been building not just a pile, but a wall. A monument. Something meant to last. You stepped closer. The beam of your flashlight swept across the stacks, illuminating the rough texture of the twine, the dust that had settled into every crevice, the faint, musty smell of old paper and dry rot that hung in the still air. The silence inside the unit was different from the silence outside. It was deeper. Older. The kind of silence that had been accumulating for decades. You reached out and touched the nearest bundle. The paper was cool and slightly rough beneath your fingers. It felt fragile, like the wing of a very old moth. You hesitated for only a moment. Then you untied the twine. It snapped easily, having lost its strength years ago. You folded back the brown paper. Inside was money. Not the kind of money you were used to. Not the crisp, green bills in your wallet. These notes were thicker, coarser, their colors muted to shades of ochre and sepia and faded plum. They were printed with intricate designs, pagodas and sailing ships and the stern faces of men you didn't recognize. The denominations were enormous, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. Numbers that seemed to belong to another world entirely. You picked up a bundle and fanned through it with your thumb. The paper was stiff and dry, crackling faintly as you handled it. The notes were in remarkably good condition, protected by the layers of wrapping and the cool, dark air of the unit. You did a rough calculation in your head. Just this single bundle, this one parcel among the dozens, perhaps hundreds, that filled the storage unit, contained the equivalent of 100,000 in old currency. And your flashlight beam, as you swept it once more across the towering stacks, revealed that there were many, many more. Your hand dropped to your side. The flashlight beam pointed at the floor, casting a small, trembling pool of light on the dusty concrete. You stood there in the silence, listening to your own breath, trying to make sense of what you had just found. It was then that you noticed something else. At the very back of the unit, tucked into the space where the stacks of parcels met the far wall, was a wooden crate. It was smaller than the bundles, rectangular, made of dark wood that had warped slightly with age. It had been placed there deliberately, half hidden, as if whoever arranged the parcels had wanted to keep it out of sight. You walked toward it. Slowly, stepping carefully around the stacks. The crate was not locked. Its metal hinges were rusted, and the lid lifted easily when you pulled on it. Inside, resting on a bed of crumpled newspaper so old that the ink had faded to ghostly gray, was a book. A ledger. Bound in dark leather, its edges worn smooth, its spine reinforced with faded blue cloth. You lifted it out. It was heavier than you expected. The rain had started outside. You could hear it now, a soft drumming on the iron roof, a sound that seemed to fill the silence without disturbing it. You closed the ledger and tucked it under your arm. Whatever this place was, whatever your uncle had been doing here for all those years, the answer was not in the parcels of old cash. The answer was in this book. And you had only just begun to read it. The ledger sat on your kitchen table for 3 days before you opened it again. It was not that you had forgotten about it. You had thought about it almost constantly. Every time you walked past the table, your eyes drifted toward its worn leather cover, its faded blue cloth spine, the way it seemed to hold the lamplight differently than the objects around it, soaking it in rather than reflecting it back. There was something patient about the book. Something that had been waiting a long time and was in no hurry now. You had been waiting, too. Waiting for the right kind of night. A night when the world outside was still enough, and the rain was falling with that particular gentleness that makes the inside of a room feel like a sanctuary. That night arrived on a Wednesday. The rain had begun at dusk, a soft, persistent patter against the window glass, the kind of rain that seems to fall not from clouds but from the darkness itself. You made a pot of tea and set it on the table beside a single lamp. The lamp cast a warm, amber circle on the wood, and you placed the ledger in the center of that circle, as if it were an artifact in a museum. Which, in a way, it was. You opened the cover. The first page crackled faintly as it turned, the sound dry and delicate, like a leaf being lifted from a forest floor. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges, and you had to be careful not to tear it. The handwriting was in black ink, faded now to a soft brown, but still perfectly legible. It was written in Chinese, in a careful, disciplined hand, the kind of penmanship that belongs to someone who learned to write with a brush before he learned to write with a pen, who had spent long hours practicing the precise angle of each stroke. The entries followed a consistent format. A date. A name. A quantity. A sum of money. The names were what caught your attention first. They were not personal names, not family names or given names. They were the names of T. Dragon Well, read one entry. Y, dated the 3rd day of the 11th month in the 17th year of the Republic, 1928, you calculated in the Western calendar. 20 crates. 3,800 silver dollars. Pu'er, read another, from the second month of the following year. 15 crates. 2,100 silver dollars. Iron Buddha, from the fifth month. 30 crates. 5,600 silver dollars. You turn the pages slowly, carefully. More tea names appeared. Biluakun. De Hong Pao. White Peony. Silver Needle. The list continued, page after page, year after year, a meticulous record of transactions that spanned nearly 2 decades. The quantities were large. The sums of money were larger. And none of it added up. You paused to think about this. In the 1920s and 1930s, even the finest tea in the world did not sell for thousands of silver dollars per crate. The economics were simply impossible. A single shipment of iron Buddha recorded in the ledger was worth more than a skilled merchant sailor might hope to earn in a lifetime. Whatever this business was, it was not about tea. The tea names were a code. A mask. A way of hiding something in plain sight. The rain outside seemed to grow a little louder, as if it, too, was leaning in to read over your shoulder. You glanced up at the window. The glass was streaked with silver, and the street lamp beyond had blurred into a soft, gold smudge against the dark. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the old house settling around you. You looked back down at the ledger and turned another page. And that was when you found the photograph. It was small, no larger than a playing card, and printed on paper so thin that the image seemed almost translucent when you held it up to the light. The photograph showed a woman. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that looked directly into the camera with a calm, unflinching directness. She wore a simple high-collared blouse, and behind her, out of focus and fading into the grain of the old paper, you could just make out the shapes of what might have been a harbor, water, the blurred lines of masts, the faint suggestion of a distant shore. There was nothing written on the photograph. No name. No date. But someone had placed it here deliberately, pressed between the pages of the ledger like a flower in a book, waiting for someone to find it. You set the photograph aside, very carefully, and continued turning the pages. The entries grew sparser as the years advanced. The sums of money grew smaller, and then, toward the end, they stopped appearing altogether. The final pages of the ledger contained no transactions at all. Instead, tucked into the fold of the binding, you found a slip of paper. It was thinner than the ledger pages, almost translucent, and the ink on it was a different color, a paler, more watery brown, as if it had been written with a fountain pen rather than a brush. The handwriting was the same as the ledger entries, the same disciplined, careful hand, but it was shakier now, less steady. The hand of someone who had grown old. The note was brief. Just a few lines. If you are reading this, then the ledger has found its way to you. The tea names are not goods. They are people. Behind every name is a life that was hidden, and a life that was saved. You turn the slip of paper over. On the back, in smaller and fainter letters, so faint you had to tilt the page toward the lamp to read them, was a single additional line. It looked as if it had been added much later, perhaps years later, by a hand that was no longer entirely steady, that had hesitated before committing these final words to paper. If you do not know where to begin, find Iron Buddha first. She is in San Francisco. You set the note down beside the photograph. Iron Buddha. Not a T. A woman. A woman who had been hidden behind the name of a T for more than 70 years. The young woman in the photograph gazed up at you from across the decades, her expression calm, her eyes steady. You found yourself wondering if she was Iron Buddha. Or if Iron Buddha was someone else entirely, someone whose name had been buried in the pages of this ledger, waiting for the right person to come looking. The rain continued outside, steady and unhurried. The lamp cast its warm amber circle on the table. And you realized, with a quiet certainty that settled over you like the sound of the rain itself, that you were no longer merely curious. Something had shifted inside you, quietly, without fanfare. The ledger had passed into your hands, and with it, a thread. A thread that led out of this room, across an ocean, and into a story that was still waiting to be told. The ledger had given you the names. But the names alone were not enough. You needed to understand what they meant. You needed to understand who your uncle had really been. A man who kept $2 million in old bills stacked in a safe, who recorded tea shipments that were not tea shipments, who left behind a note telling you that behind every name was a life. Such a man had a story. And that story was still waiting to be told. You returned to the storage unit on a night when the rain had softened to a fine mist, the kind that hung in the air like breath and made the streetlights glow with halos of pale gold. The drive felt shorter than it once had. You had made this trip so many times now that the roads had become familiar, the turns anticipated, the landmarks, the rusted water tower, the abandoned gas station, the gravel track that led to the facility, etched into your memory. You had brought a new flashlight, its batteries fresh and heavy in your hand, and a thermos of hot coffee that steamed in the cool night air. Tonight, you were not here for the money. You were here for the other things. The things you had overlooked on your first visits, when the shock of discovery had narrowed your vision to the safe and the cash and the strange, coded ledger. Now, you allowed your eyes to wander. The unit was more than a vault. It was an archive. A museum of one man's hidden life. In the far corner, behind the stacks of parcels and the old wooden crate, half hidden beneath a canvas tarp that had stiffened with age, you noticed a pair of battered leather suitcases. You had seen them on your first visit but had not opened them. There had been too much else to take in. Now, you dragged them out into the center of the concrete floor, the metal clasps cold against your fingers, and knelt beside them. The first suitcase opened with a creak of old leather. Inside were clothes, simple, well-made, worn soft by years of use. A wool coat, dark gray, its lining frayed at the edges. Seve. Raw white shirts, folded with military precision, the collars slightly yellowed. A pair of black leather shoes, polished to a soft shine, the soles worn thin but still intact. You lifted the coat and held it for a moment. It smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, the same scent that permeated the unit. These were not the clothes of a rich man. They were the clothes of someone who had taken care of what he owned, who had mended rather than replaced, who had lived simply even while guarding a fortune. The second suitcase was heavier. You set it flat on the concrete and worked the clasps. They were stiff with rust, but they gave way. Inside, packed neatly in layers like sediment in a geological formation, was a stack of documents. Letters, some in envelopes, some folded and tied with string. Ship manifests, their paper brittle and yellowed, covered in stamps and signatures in fading ink. Yellowed newspaper clippings, cut carefully from their pages, their headlines announcing events that had long since passed into history. And at the very bottom, tied with a faded red ribbon that had once been bright, a bundle of envelopes addressed in handwriting you did not recognize. You untied the ribbon. It came apart easily, the silk having lost its strength decades ago. You opened the first envelope. The letter inside was written in English, in a hand that was not your uncle's, a looser, more flowing script, the letters slanting forward as if the writer had been in a hurry. The letterhead, embossed in fading blue ink, read Pacific Import Company, San Francisco, California. The date was March 17, 1924. Dear Sir, the letter began. The shipment of Dragon Well has arrived safely at our warehouse on Front Street. Customs was more difficult than anticipated, but our contact at the port came through as promised. The crates are now secure. We await your instructions for distribution to the usual parties. Please advise on the Pu'er shipment. There has been some delay in Oakland. Dragon Well. Pu'er. The tea names from the ledger. But this letter was not about tea. You read it again, more slowly, and the truth began to reveal itself. The Pacific Import Company was a front. The crates were not filled with dried leaves. They were filled with bottles, Chinese white spirit, yellow wine, medicinal spirits, bound for the speakeasies of San Francisco's Chinatown and North Beach. During Prohibition, when alcohol was illegal throughout the United States, a vast underground network had sprung up to supply the demand. Your uncle had been part of it. Not a small-time bootlegger, but an architect of routes that stretched from the coastal cities of southeastern China, across the vast emptiness of the Pacific, to the busy docks of San Francisco Bay. You opened another letter. Then another. The story they told was not one of simple greed. It was one of survival, of community, of people who had been shut out of the regular economy building their own in the shadows. The men who worked these routes were immigrants, Chinese, Italian, Irish, who had come to America with nothing and found that the official world had no place for them. The banks would not lend to them. The law would not protect them. So they had created their own banks. Their own laws. Their own economy, hidden beneath the surface of the official one. Your uncle had been their banker, their accountant, their keeper of records. The ledger with its T names was not a simple code, it was the general ledger of an entire underground financial system. Dragon Well was the San Francisco line. Pu'er was Oakland. Iron Buddha was Los Angeles. Bilyuakun was Seattle. Each T name corresponded to a specific route, a specific contact, a specific network of speakeasies and private clubs. The money in the safe, the $2 million in old, worn bills, was not merely profit. It was the accumulated trust of an entire community, held in trust by a man who had never betrayed it. If your eyes are growing heavy, if the rhythm of the rain on the iron roof is beginning to pull you toward sleep, then let it. These letters will still be here when you wake. The story will still be here. The old bills have waited nearly a century in the dark. They can wait a little longer while you rest. At the very bottom of the second suitcase, beneath the last of the letters and the manifests and the brittle newspaper clippings, you found a single sheet of paper. It was different from the others. Thinner, more fragile, as if it had been handled many times over many years. On it, written in your uncle's careful, deliberate hand, was a list. Not T names this time. Real names. Chinese names. Italian names. Irish names. Each one followed by a city, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, Seattle, and a date, and a sum of money. Some of the names had been crossed out. The ink was pressed so hard into the paper that it had left deep grooves, as if your uncle had wanted to be certain, absolutely certain, that those names were marked as finished. Others had a small red circle drawn beside them, the ink faded to a pale rust color. Your finger moved slowly down the list, tracing the names. Most were crossed out. Most of the rest were circled. But the very last name on the list was untouched. No line through it. No circle beside it. Just the name, written in the same careful, steady script, and beside it, in letters so small and faint you had to hold the paper up to the lamp to read them, a single line of text. A note that your uncle had added, perhaps years after the list was first written, in the shakier hand of his old age. This one is still living. Chinatown, San Francisco. If you read this, go to her. She has been waiting 70 years. The list began not as a list but as a stack of notes, scribbled on scraps of paper and the backs of old envelopes, spread across your kitchen table like a hand of cards you were still learning to read. You had been at this work for several nights now, ever since you had found the names in the ledger and the letters in the suitcase. The T names, Dragon Well, Pu'er, Iron Buddha, had been the key. Behind each one was a real person. A contact. A smuggler. A boatman. A middleman who had moved crates of contraband liquor from the docks to the speakeasies. Your uncle had recorded them all, year after year, in his careful, patient hand. Now, you were recording them too. You worked by lamplight, the old green-shaded desk lamp casting its warm amber circle across the table. Outside, the rain had become a constant, a soft, steady presence that you no longer noticed except in the moments when it paused, as if catching its breath, before resuming its gentle rhythm against the window glass. The house was quiet. The clock on the mantel ticked with its familiar, unhurried patience. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed its low, electrical note, a sound so ordinary that it had become a kind of silence in itself. The work was slow. The handwriting in the ledger was faded and sometimes difficult to read, the ink having paled over the decades from black to a soft, watery brown. You had to cross-reference each entry with the letters and manifests you had found in the suitcase, matching T names to real names, routes to faces. Some entries were clear and complete. Others were fragmentary, a first name without a surname, a city without an address, a date without a year. You filled in what you could and left blank spaces for what you could not. Gradually, over the course of several evenings, the list took shape. 17 names in total. Each one followed by a city, a date, and a notation in your uncle's careful hand. Some of the notations were simple. A single word, written Bess. I'd the name in ink that had faded to a gentle brown, cleared. The letters were formed with a steady, unhurried confidence, as if your uncle had been satisfied when he wrote them. Others were more cryptic. Pending. Held. Words that suggested unfinished business, accounts that had not yet been settled. A few names had been crossed out entirely, not with a single line, but with repeated strokes, the ink pressed so hard into the paper that it had left deep grooves. Whatever had happened to those people, your uncle had wanted to mark their stories as closed. Final. Done. You wondered what had happened to them. You wondered if anyone else had ever wondered. The rain had softened to a fine drizzle, barely audible against the window. The lamplight flickered once, a brief, almost imperceptible dimming, and then steadied. The house settled around you with a quiet creak, the way old houses do when the night grows cool. You pulled your sweater tighter and turned to the next task. The search. You had been putting it off, perhaps because you sensed that once you began, the names would become more than names. They would become people. Stories. Lives that had intersected with your uncle's in ways you were only beginning to understand. But the list was complete now, and the question that had been forming in your mind ever since you had first opened the ledger would not be ignored any longer. You opened your laptop. The screen glowed pale blue in the dim room, casting a cool light across the scattered papers. The contrast between the warm amber of the lamp and the cold blue of the screen felt appropriate. Somehow, the past and the present, side by side, waiting to be connected. You began with the first name on the list. A man who had been the contact for the Dragon Well line, San Francisco. The ledger noted that he had been a grocer on Stockton Street, that his account was marked cleared in that same steady hand. You typed his name into the search bar and pressed enter. The results came quickly. An obituary. Dated 1962. He had lived to be 74. He had died in San Francisco, in the same neighborhood where he had run his grocery store for more than 40 years. The obituary mentioned his wife of 52 years, his 3 children, his 7 grandchildren. It described him as a devoted family man and a pillar of the community. It did not mention the speakeasy that had operated in the basement beneath his store. It did not mention the crates of Chinese liquor that had passed through his back room on their way to the private clubs of North Beach. Some secrets, you realized, stay secret even after death. You moved to the next name. Then the next. The rain continued its patient rhythm against the glass, and the clock on the mantel marked the passing hours with its steady, unhurried tick. Some of the names yielded nothing, no obituary, no record, no trace. They had vanished into the silence of history, their stories untold, their fates unknown. Others had left behind fragments. A marriage license from 1934. A census record showing a family of 5 living in a 2-room apartment above a laundry. A grave marker in a cemetery you had never visited, its inscription worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. And a few, the ones who had been younger when the smuggling operation was at its peak, had descendants who were very much alive. You found one of them on a professional networking site, a man in his 40s, the grandson of the Pu'er contact in Oakland. His profile showed him in a well-tailored suit, standing in front of a glass office building in downtown San Francisco, a confident smile on his face. He was a financial advisor. He managed portfolios, advised clients on retirement planning, helped people build futures. His grandfather, you knew from the ledger, had run a speakeasy out of the back of a Chinese laundry, had hidden bottles of illegal liquor beneath stacks of pressed shirts, had risked imprisonment every night so that his family could eat. The contrast was almost too perfect to be accidental. Another descendant lived in Los Angeles. She was a schoolteacher, the great-niece of the Iron Buddha contact. Her social media profiles were filled with pictures of her classroom, her garden, her golden retriever. She seemed happy. She seemed ordinary. She almost certainly had no idea that her great-uncle had been one of the key figures in a trans-Pacific smuggling network that had moved millions of dollars through the shadows. You recorded each discovery in your notes, adding new layers to the list. Beside each name, you wrote what you had found. Deceased, 1962. Deceased, date unknown. Living descendant located. No trace found. The list was no longer just a list. It was a map. A map of lives that had intersected with your uncle's, that had been shaped by his choices, and that had, in some small way, contributed to the fortune that now sat in the storage unit on the edge of town. When you finally reached the last name on the list, you stopped. Your hand paused above the keyboard. It was the name your uncle had marked with the smallest notation, the faintest ink, as if he had been running out of time when he wrote it, or as if he had been uncertain whether to include it at all. Iron Buddha. The woman in the photograph tucked into the ledger. The one your uncle had written about in the note on the back of the T-name cipher. You searched for her, expecting to find another obituary, another faded record of a life long since ended. But the search returned something unexpected. A listing. A small tea shop. In San Francisco's Chinatown. Still in operation. The address was on a narrow street you had never heard of, in a neighborhood you had never visited. The owner's name matched the name on your list. You stared at the screen for a long moment, the blue glow reflecting softly on your face. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to seep through the curtains. The tea shop was real. The woman was still alive. She had been waiting for 70 years. The flight to San Francisco took 6 hours. You spent most of them looking out the window, watching the land give way to cloud and then to the vast, gray sweep of the Pacific. The woman beside you was asleep before the plane left the runway. The man across the aisle was reading a newspaper, his glasses perched low on his nose. Everything was ordinary. Everything was as it always was. And yet, beneath your feet, in the cargo hold, wrapped in a leather case you had not let out of your sight since you left the house, was the ledger. You had not been to San Francisco before. The city greeted you with fog, soft and gray, rolling in through the Golden Gate and spilling over the hills like a slow tide. The air smelled of salt and diesel and something faintly sweet, fresh bread, perhaps, or the ghost of jasmine from a garden you could not see. You took a cab from the airport, giving the driver an address on a street you had found in the online listing. The driver nodded without speaking. He had probably taken 100 people to Chinatown before you. The cab wound through the city, past the gleaming towers of downtown and the pastel houses of the hills, until the streets grew narrower and the signs began to appear in Chinese. The buildings here were older, their facades painted in shades of red and gold and faded green. Strings of paper lanterns hung across the streets, their colors muted by the fog. The sidewalks were crowded with tourists and locals, with grandmothers pulling shopping carts and children running ahead of their parents. The cab stopped at the mouth of an alley too narrow for it to enter. You paid the driver and stepped out into the cool, damp air. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. The walls on either side were brick, painted decades ago in colors that had since faded to soft pastels. Above your head, more lanterns hung from wires strung between the buildings, their paper skins worn thin by years of rain and wind. Tea. The ground beneath your feet was paved with old cobblestones, slick with moisture. At the end of the alley, where the buildings seemed to lean toward each other like old friends sharing a secret, you found it. A tea shop. Small, unassuming. A wooden sign above the door read Iron Buddha Tea Company in faded gold letters. The windows were steamed over, and through the glass you could just make out the shapes of shelves lined with canisters and boxes. A bell rang as you pushed open the door. The shop was warm inside, warmer than the street, and it smelled of toasted leaves and old wood and something floral you could not name. The shelves that lined the walls were filled with tea, canisters of green tea, boxes of oolong, jars of pu'er wrapped in paper. A brass cash register sat on the counter, its keys worn smooth by decades of use. And behind the counter, sitting on a wooden stool with a cup of tea in her hands, was an old woman. She was small, her back slightly curved with age, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her face was lined but her eyes were clear, and they regarded you with a calm, unhurried curiosity. She did not speak. She simply waited, the way people wait when they have learned that most things come in their own time. You set the leather case on the counter. You opened it. You took out the ledger, its leather cover worn smooth, its pages yellowed with age. You placed it between you, and then you took the photograph from the inside pocket of your jacket, the photograph of the young woman outside the bank, and placed it beside the ledger. Finally, you took out the note. The one your uncle had written. The one that said Iron Buddha is still living. Chinatown, San Francisco. Go to her. The old woman looked at the ledger. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the note. And then she was silent for a very long time. The only sound in the shop was the soft hiss of a kettle on a hot plate somewhere in the back room, and the distant murmur of traffic on the street outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You are his nephew," she said. It was not a question. You nodded. She set down her cup of tea. Then, moving slowly, carefully, the way people move when their bodies have been alive for nearly a century, she bent down and reached beneath the counter. You heard the scrape of something heavy being dragged across wood. When she straightened, she was holding a metal box. It was old, its surface rusted in places, its lid held shut by a simple clasp. She placed it on the counter between you. The clasp opened with a soft click. Inside the box, packed tightly together, were envelopes. Dozens of them. Some were yellowed with age, their paper brittle and fragile. Others were still white, as if they had been written more recently. Some had stamps. Some did not. Some had addresses written in careful, flowing script. Some had no address at all. The old woman had her hand on the edge of the box. Her fingers were thin, the skin translucent with age. She looked at the letters, and then she looked at you. "These," she said, "are the letters that were never sent. The ones that were returned. The ones that were written and then hidden away, because there was no one left to send them to. Wives wrote to husbands. Mothers wrote to sons. Children wrote to fathers they had never met. They gave them to me because I was the youngest, because they thought I would live long enough to find someone to give them to." She paused. Outside, a cable car rang its bell somewhere in the distance. "I have been waiting 70 years, she said. "For you." The old woman pushed the metal box across the counter toward you. Her hands, thin and spotted with age, rested on its rusted lid for a moment longer, as if she were saying goodbye to something she had kept close for a very long time. Her fingers traced the edge of the box once, twice, and then she nodded once, turned, and disappeared through the beaded curtain that led to the back room. The beads clicked softly together in her wake, a sound like rain on a tin roof. You did not follow her. You understood that what she had given you was meant to be opened alone. You brought the box back to your hotel. It was an old place on the edge of Chinatown, its rooms small and worn but clean, its windows looking out onto a narrow alley strung with red paper lanterns. The lanterns glowed all night, their light seeping through the thin curtains and casting a long, amber stripe across the ceiling. The rain had returned, not the hard, driving rain of a storm, but a gentle, persistent drizzle that tapped against the window glass like an old friend asking to be let in. You could hear it as you sat on the edge of the bed, the box resting on the mattress beside you. The room was warm, the radiator humming its low, metallic song, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and the jasmine tea you had bought from the old woman before leaving her shop. You opened the lid. Inside, packed tightly together, were letters. Dozens of them. Their envelopes were of different sizes and colors, some cream, some brown, some the pale blue of old airmail stationery. Some were addressed in careful brushstrokes, the ink faded to a soft brown. Others were written in pencil, the graphite smudged by time and handling. A few had no address at all, just a name, or a title, mother, wife, my son, as if the writer had known the letter would never be mailed but had written it anyway, because some words need to be said even when there is no one to receive them. The paper smelled of dust and age and something faintly sweet. Like the memory of incense burned long ago. You picked up the first letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and you had to handle it with care. It crackled softly as you unfolded it, a sound like dry leaves stirring in a breeze. The handwriting was a woman's, delicate, precise, the strokes of a brush rather than a pen. Each character had been formed with patience, with attention, as if the act of writing itself was a kind of prayer. There was no date. No greeting. Just the words, set down as if they had been waiting a very long time to be spoken. The weather has turned cold. When you left, you took only 2 thin shirts. I do not know if they are enough. If they are not, send word and I will make you a padded coat. You turned the page over. There was nothing on the back. No signature. No name. Just the quiet, practical concern of a woman who had no way of knowing whether the man she loved was warm or cold, hungry or fed, alive or dead. You imagined her sitting by a window, perhaps, in a village you had never seen, brushing the characters onto the page while the wind rattled the shutters and the sea murmured in the distance. You imagined her folding the letter, sealing it, pressing it into the hands of a neighbor who was traveling to the port. You imagined her waiting for a reply that never came. You set the letter aside and picked up another. This one was written on rougher paper, the kind that might have been torn from a child's exercise book. The handwriting was a man's, strong, angular, the characters pressed deep into the paper as if the writer had been gripping the brush too hard. The letter was dated 1931. Mother's illness has improved. Do not worry. We have received the money you sent. It arrived just in time. The doctor has been paid. There is enough left for the winter. When will you come home? You read through the letters one by one, the hours passing unnoticed as the rain continued its soft percussion against the window. The clock on the nightstand ticked steadily on, its hands moving through the hours without your notice. The radiator clicked and hummed. The red lanterns in the alley swayed in the wind, their light flickering against the glass like the pulse of some slow, distant heartbeat. The letters came from villages in Fujian, from fishing towns in Guangdong, from mountain hamlets in Zhejiang whose names you had never heard before. They were written by wives and mothers and brothers and children. Some were long, filling several pages with news of harvests and illnesses and marriages and births. Others were only a few lines, a question, a plea, a whispered prayer sent across the ocean. None of them spoke of history. None of them mentioned the wars or the revolutions or the great movements of nations. They spoke only of the small things. The ordinary things. A father's cough that had finally eased. A child's first steps. A debt that had been repaid. A wedding that had been postponed until the groom's brother could return from across the sea. And then, near the middle of the stack, you found a letter that was different from the rest. It was written in pencil, on a sheet of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases were beginning to tear. The handwriting was a child's, the characters large and uneven, the strokes hesitant, as if the writer had been learning to write and had not yet mastered the skill. There were erasures. Smudges where a small, determined hand had rubbed the paper. A small tear in the corner where the pencil had been pressed too hard. The letter was short. Just a few lines. Father, Mother says you went far away to earn money. When are you coming back? I got third place in my class. The teacher gave me a red paper as a prize. I am keeping it for you. And at the bottom of the page, drawn in the same unsteady pencil, was a picture. A boat. It was not a good boat, the hull was too short, the mast too tall, the sail a crooked triangle that looked nothing like a real sail. The proportions were all wrong. But it was unmistakably a boat. And on the deck of the boat, standing at the bow, was a tiny stick figure with a round head and arms outstretched toward the horizon. Next to the figure, in the same careful, childish handwriting, were two characters, "It's me." You held the letter for a long time. The rain had grown heavier outside, drumming against the window with a steady, insistent rhythm. The red lanterns in the alley swayed harder now, their light flickering against the glass. You thought about the child who had drawn that picture, the small, determined fingers gripping the pencil, the tongue perhaps poking from the corner of the mouth in concentration. He would be old now, if he was still alive. His father had probably never seen the drawing. Had probably never known that his son had gotten third place in his class, or that a red paper prize was waiting for him, folded carefully in a drawer somewhere, growing brittle with age. You set the letter aside, very gently, and reached into the box for the next one. But your fingers touched something different. At the very bottom of the box, tucked beneath all the other letters, was an envelope that was thicker than the rest. It had been pressed flat by the weight of everything above it, its edges worn soft. You pulled it out. The paper was cream-colored, the same stationery your uncle had used for his ledgers. The handwriting on the front was your uncle's, the same careful, deliberate script you had come to know so well. But the letter inside was not from him. It was a letter that had been written to "Oh, your grandfather. By your grandmother." The characters were in a woman's hand, similar to the first letter you had read, but more hurried, more urgent. She had written quickly, as if the words had been pressing against her and she had needed to get them out before they vanished. And then, mid-sentence, the writing stopped. The last character was only half-formed, the brush lifted before the stroke was complete. Above the broken character, a small, circular stain had bloomed across the paper, not spilled tea, not rain, but the unmistakable mark of a tear that had fallen and dried long before you were born. The letter from your grandmother lay on the nightstand beside the bed. You had read it so many times now that the words had begun to feel like your own, or like words you had known a long time ago and only just remembered. The broken character at the end, the half-formed stroke where the brush had lifted and never returned. The small, circular stain where a tear had fallen and dried. Your grandmother had written to your grandfather across an ocean that had no bottom and no shore, and the letter had never been sent. It had been kept, instead, by your uncle, a man who was not, you now understood, your uncle at all. The morning light was just beginning to seep through the curtains, pale and gray, the color of old silver. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but the streets of Chinatown were still wet, the cobblestones glistening under the red lanterns that swayed gently in the morning breeze. The city was waking up around you, you could hear the distant clang of a cable car bell, the low rumble of a delivery truck on the street below, the sharp cry of a gull wheeling somewhere over the bay. But here, in this small room at the edge of Chinatown, everything was still. Everything was quiet. You sat at the small desk by the window, the ledger and the letters and the list of names spread out before you like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting decades to be assembled. The pieces had been there all along. You had simply not known how to fit them together. Your grandfather had not been your uncle's brother. That was the first thing you had to understand, and it was the hardest. They had not shared blood. They had shared something else, a bond forged not in family but in risk, in loyalty, in the long, dark nights on the Pacific when the only thing standing between a man and the sea were the wooden hull of a cargo vessel and the steady hand of the sailor beside him. Your grandfather had been your uncle's partner. Not a relative, but something closer. A friend. A shipmate. A man who had stood beside your uncle on the deck of that nameless cargo vessel as it pitched through the swells of the Pacific, salt spray freezing on their faces, the lights of San Francisco still 3 days away. A man who had hauled crates of contraband liquor through the fog of San Francisco Bay, who had sat in the basements of speakeasies counting stacks of cash by lamplight, who had risked his life, and, in the end, given it, for the strange, quiet empire your uncle had built in the shadows. Your grandfather had been a sailor. A smuggler. A man whose name appeared in the ledger not as a contact or a middleman, but in the margins, in the small notes your uncle had written beside the entries for wages paid and shares distributed. You had seen those notes before, but you had not understood them. Now, as you turned the pages of the ledger with new eyes, you saw them everywhere. Paid to Chen. Share for this quarter, delivered to his wife. Held for the family. Each note was a small, quiet record of a promise kept. Each one was a thread connecting the money in the storage unit to the people it had always been meant to reach. Your grandfather had died at sea. You did not know the details, the ledger did not record them, and the letters did not say. Perhaps there had been a storm. Perhaps there had been an accident. Perhaps he had simply fallen ill on a long voyage and never recovered. Whatever had happened, it had happened far from home, far from the wife who was writing him letters that would never be delivered, far from the son who would grow up without a father. And your uncle had carried the weight of that death for the rest of his life. You sat back in your chair and looked out the window. The morning sun had broken through the clouds now, casting long, slanting shadows across the alley below. The red lanterns were still lit, though their glow was almost invisible in the daylight. A woman in an apron was sweeping the steps of the building across the street. A cat was sitting on a windowsill, watching something you could not see. The world went on, as it always did, as it always had. The storage unit. The $2 million. The ledger. The letters. The list of names. They were not a random inheritance, handed down to the last living relative because there was no one else. They were a trust. A responsibility. Your uncle had kept the money safe not because he wanted it, not because he had earned it, but because it belonged to the families of the men who worked his routes, the sailors and the boatmen and the dockworkers who had risked their lives for a share of the profits, and whose families had never received what they were owed. Your grandfather had been one of them. And your uncle had spent 50 years trying to make good on the debt. He had paid the rent on that storage unit, year after year, long after the money inside had ceased to have any legal value. He had kept the ledger, recording every name, every share, every obligation that had not yet been discharged. He had written the note, behind every name is a life that was hidden, and a life that was saved, not as an explanation, but as an instruction. A charge. A final request to whoever came after him. Let this secret rest beside you now. You are not required to solve everything tonight. You have read enough. You have understood enough. The debt is not yours to carry alone. Close your eyes, and the story will still be here when you wake. You look down at the list of names on the desk before you. 17 of them. You had counted them again and again, as if the number might change. 12 confirmed dead. For untraceable, their names had vanished into the silence of history, their descendants scattered to places you might never find. And one name still living. The old woman in the tea shop. Iron Buddha. The last living witness to the world your uncle had built, the last person who could tell you what had happened in the years between the letter and the ledger, between the photograph and the safe, between the promise and its fulfillment. The money in the storage unit was not yours. It had never been yours. It belonged to the families of the men whose names were on that list, the sailors who had never come home, the boatmen who had died at sea, the dockworkers who had grown old waiting for a share of the profits that had been promised to them decades ago. Your uncle had kept the money safe for them. He had not been able to finish the work. So he had passed it to you. Not because you were his blood. Not because you were the last living relative. But because you were the person who had opened the door. The person who had read the ledger. The person who had followed the trail all the way to this small room in Chinatown, with the red lantern swaying outside the window and the list of names spread out on the desk before you. The promise was still waiting to be fulfilled. And now, the task of fulfilling it had passed to you. You returned to the storage unit on a gray afternoon in late autumn, when the trees along the gravel road had shed their last leaves and the air carried the clean, cold scent of approaching winter. The key turned in the lock with the same quiet ease it always had, and the door rose with its familiar rumble. Inside, the parcels of old cash still stood in their careful stacks against the far wall, but you barely glanced at them now. You were here for something else. The things you had overlooked. The things that mattered more than money. You had brought a portable lamp this time, and you set it up in the center of the concrete floor, its warm light pushing back the shadows. The storage unit had begun to feel less like a vault and more like a room, a place where someone had spent countless hours, not just storing things, but living among them. The old wooden chair in the corner. The writing desk pushed against the wall. The cardboard boxes you had dismissed on your first visit, too overwhelmed by the discovery of the cash to pay them any attention. Now, you opened those boxes one by one. And what you found began to change everything you thought you knew about the man who had built this place. The first box contained photographs. Dozens of them, some in black and white, some in the faded, oversaturated colors of early Kodachrome. They were not the formal portraits of a wealthy man. They were snapshots. Unposed. Ordinary. A group of men standing on a dock, their faces creased with laughter, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. A young woman holding a baby, squinting into the sun. A fishing boat bobbing in a gray sea. The same woman, older now, standing in front of a tea shop with her hands folded. The old woman in Chinatown. Iron Buddha. She was in many of these photographs, and always, she was smiling. The second box was heavier. Inside were journals. Not ledgers, not the careful, coded accounts of the smuggling operation, but personal journals, written in the S. Aim steady hand. You opened the earliest one. The date on the first page was 1924. Your uncle, your grandfather's partner, the man you were only now beginning to understand, had been 23 years old. The entries were not what you expected. They were not the confessions of a criminal, nor the justifications of a man trying to convince himself that what he was doing was right. They were the quiet, unremarkable observations of a young man far from home. He wrote about the weather. About the food. About the strange, wonderful city of San Francisco, with its hills and its fog and its streets full of people speaking a dozen different languages. He wrote about the first time he saw the Pacific Ocean, standing on the deck of a cargo ship with the salt wind in his face, feeling as if he had reached the edge of the world. You turned the pages slowly, the hours passing unnoticed as the lamp burned its steady glow. The rain had started again outside, a soft, insistent drumming on the iron roof that seemed to wrap itself around the silence rather than break it. The early entries gave way to later ones. The tone began to shift. He wrote about the difficulty of the work. About the close calls with the Coast Guard. About a friend, your grandfather, who had been lost at sea in a storm, and the weight of the grief that followed. He wrote about the families of the men who worked his routes, the widows and orphans who depended on him. He wrote about the promises he had made, and the promises he had not yet been able to keep. He never married. He never had children of his own. Instead, he spent his life taking care of other people's families. The money in the safe was not his. It had never been his. It was theirs. And he had guarded it for them, year after year, decade after decade, long after it had ceased to have any value except as a record of obligations still owed. The last journal was the thinnest. The entries were shorter now, the handwriting shakier. He was old. He was tired. He knew he did not have much time left. And on the very last page, written the week before he died, he had left a final message. Not to anyone in particular. Just to whoever found this place, whoever opened these boxes, whoever was curious enough, or stubborn enough, to follow the trail all the way to its end. The ledger is for the next generation. The letters are for the old friends. The money, please burn it. But I suspect you won't. And beside the words, drawn with a brush in a shaky but still careful hand, was a small, crooked smile. The rain had returned by the time you made your decision. Not a storm, not a downpour, but the same steady, patient drizzle that had been falling on and off since the day you first received the letter from the lawyer in Portland. It tapped against the window of your study with a soft, insistent rhythm, as if it was waiting for you to catch up. You sat at your desk, the green-shaded lamp casting its familiar amber circle across the wood. Before you lay three objects, the ledger, the list of names, and a blank sheet of paper on which you had written, in your own hand, a single word. Burn. It was the question your uncle had left you. The last line of his final journal entry, written the week before he died. The money, please burn it. But I suspect you won't. Beside the words, he had drawn that small, crooked smile, two brushstrokes, one curving up, one curving down, together forming a face that was almost, but not quite, laughing at you. You had thought about that smile for a long time. You had thought about what it meant, and what your uncle had meant, and what you were supposed to do with the $2 million in old, worn bills that still sat in the storage unit on the edge of town. The money was worthless in the eyes of the law. The currencies had changed. The statutes of limitation had expired. The original owners were dead, their descendants scattered across the country and the world. You could have burned it, as your uncle had suggested. You could have walked away and let the storage unit be someone else's problem. But you had not done that. You had done the opposite. You had followed the trail all the way to San Francisco. You had found the old woman in the tea shop. You had read the letters. You had learned the names. And now, sitting at your desk with the rain tapping against the glass, you picked up your pen and drew a line through the word burn. Beneath it, you wrote, return to the names. The museum was the first call you made. It was a small institutio. And, dedicated to the history of the region, housed in a converted warehouse not far from the port. The curator was a woman with a quiet voice and a patient manner, and when you told her what you had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then she asked if she could come and see for herself. You said yes. She arrived the next afternoon, a slight woman in a gray coat, carrying a leather satchel and a magnifying glass. You led her into the storage unit and watched as she examined the parcels of old cash, the ledger, the letters, the photographs. Her hands trembled slightly as she held one of the bills up to the light, studying the faded ink, the intricate patterns, the stern faces of long-dead officials. These are extraordinary, she said quietly. They're not just currency. They're documents. They tell a story that almost no one knows. You donated a portion of the old bills to the museum. Not all of them, there were still names on the list, still promises that had not been kept. But enough to preserve the history. Enough to ensure that the story your uncle had guarded for so long would not be lost. The curator asked if you wanted your name on the exhibit. You told her to use your uncle's name instead. The letters came next. You wrote them by hand, one by one, sitting at your desk in the quiet hours of the evening. Each letter was brief. You explained that many years ago, a man had worked on a cargo ship that ran between China and San Francisco. You explained that he had been owed a share of the profits, and that the debt had never been paid. You explained that you were writing now, all these years later, not as a settlement, but as a remembrance. A small gesture. A late greeting from someone who had never been forgotten. Into each envelope, you slipped a single old bill. They were not worth much anymore, not in the way money is usually worth something. But they carried a weight that had nothing to do with their face value. They were proof. Evidence. A tangible reminder that someone, somewhere, had once risked everything for the people he loved. The weeks passed. The rain came and went. You went about the ordinary rhythms of your life, work, meals, sleep, but in the quiet moments, you found yourself checking the mailbox more often than usual. The first week brought nothing. The second week, the same. You began to wonder if the addresses were too old, if the descendants had moved, if the letters had been lost in the vast machinery of the postal system. But you did not worry. The act of sending them had been enough. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, you opened the mailbox and found it. A plain white envelope, its edges slightly worn, its surface marked with the stamps and cancellations of a long journey. The return address was a village you had never heard of, on the coast of Fujian province, a place so small it barely appeared on any map. You opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. Black and white, faded with age, its edges curled. It showed a young woman holding a child, standing in front of an old stone house. She wore a traditional jacket with a high collar, her hair pulled back, her expression calm and direct. The child was small, perhaps a year old, clutching the fabric of her sleeve. You turned the photograph over. On the back, in blue ballpoint pen, someone had written a single line. The strokes were firm, pressed deep into the paper. "This is my great-grandmother. She waited for my great-grandfather for 50 years. Thank you for telling us that he never forgot the way home." You came back to the storage unit one last time. Not because you had to. Not because there was anything left to find. The parcels of old cash were gone, distributed to museums and descendants and the quiet places where history is kept. The letters had been read and catalogued. The names on the list had been checked off, one by one, until only the memories remained. But you came back anyway. You came back because, after everything, the tea shop in Chinatown, the photograph from the fishing village in Fujian, the old woman with her iron box of unmailed letters, you felt that you owed the place a goodbye. It was late afternoon when you arrived, but the sky was already darkening. Autumn was giving way to winter, and the days had grown short. The clouds hung low and heavy over the bare black trees, their branches glistening with the moisture that had been falling on and off for weeks. The gravel track leading to the storage facility was slick with rain, and your tires left deep, temporary impressions in the mud as you pulled up to the chain-link gate. The floodlight above the entrance had already come on, its pale orange glow casting long shadows across the wet asphalt. The storage facility was quiet. No other cars sat in the parking lot. No other visitors walked the long rows of identical metal doors. Just you, and the rain, and the silence. You had brought the key, of course. It had been in your pocket for so long now that it felt like part of you, its weight familiar against your thigh, its brass surface worn smooth from the constant friction of your fingers. The iron tag with the number 1931 had grown so faint from handling that the digits were barely legible anymore. You had rubbed them nearly away without meaning to, the way a person might worry a smooth stone between thumb and forefinger during a long walk. You fitted the key into the padlock, turned it, and heard the familiar, satisfying click. The door rose with its familiar rumble, the corrugated metal shuddering in its tracks, and the smell of old cedar drifted out to meet you like an old friend. The unit had changed since your first visit. You remembered that day vividly, the shock of the flashlight beam falling on those towering stacks of brown paper parcels, the disbelief as you unfolded the first bundle and saw the old bills inside, the weight of the ledger in your hands. Now, the parcels were gone. Most of them had been donated to the museum, where they would be preserved as artifacts of a forgotten era. The rest had been sent off in envelopes to the descendants of the men whose names were recorded in the ledger, sailors, boatmen, dockworkers whose families had waited decades for a sign that they had not been forgotten. The cardboard boxes that had once held photographs and letters and journals had been sorted through, their contents organized and labeled with care. The old photographs were in archival sleeves now, protected from the ravages of time. The letters were in a fireproof safe in your study at home, along with the journals and the ledger and the small, crooked smile your uncle had drawn on the last page of his diary. But the chair was still there. The old rattan chair in the corner, the one your uncle had sat in for all those years, night after night, listening to the rain on the iron roof and turning the pages of his ledger by lamplight. You had never moved it. In all the weeks you had spent here, sorting and cataloging and packing, you had never even sat in it yourself. It felt like his chair. It felt like sitting in it would be an intrusion, a trespass. But tonight, on this last visit, you wanted to know what it had felt like to be him. The chair creaked softly as you settled into it, the old rattan adjusting to your weight with a sound like a whispered complaint. It was not a comfortable chair, it had never been meant to be. The seat was hard, the back angled slightly forward, as if it wanted you to stay alert, to pay attention, to keep working. But there was something right about the way it held you. Something that felt like permission. You leaned back as far as the chair would allow and let your eyes wander across the empty space. The unit was not completely bare. A few cardboard boxes remained, stacked neatly against the far wall, waiting to be loaded into your car. The old wooden crate that had held the ledger was still there, its lid propped open, its interior empty except for a few scraps of the crumpled newspaper that had cushioned the book. The portable lamp you had brought on your later visit sat on the concrete floor, its cord coiled beside it like a sleeping snake. And on the walls, you could still see the faint, rectangular impressions where the stacks of parcels had pressed against the corrugated metal for all those decades, ghostly outlines, like the shadows left on a wall after a painting has been taken down. You closed your eyes. The rain drummed steadily on the iron roof, a sound you had come to know as well as your own heartbeat. It was louder here than it was at home, amplified by the metal ceiling, filling the small space with its patient, insistent rhythm. You imagined your uncle sitting in this same chair, on nights just like this one, listening to the same rain. You imagined him turning the pages of his ledger, the lamplight flickering over the names and numbers, his pen moving steadily across the paper. You imagined him pausing, sometimes, to look up at the door, as if expecting someone to walk through it, a sailor returning from a long voyage, a friend he had not seen in years. You imagined him thinking of the men who had sailed with him, the ones who had come back and the ones who had not. You imagined him thinking of your grandfather, lost at sea, and of your grandmother, writing letters that would never be delivered. You imagined him carrying all of that, the grief, the guilt, the promises, the hope, alone, in this small, dark room, for 50 years. You can close your eyes now, too. The story of this storage unit has reached its end. You have carried it as far as it can go. The rest belongs to the rain. You opened your eyes. The lamp was still on, its glow pale against the deepening darkness outside. You stood, slowly, your joints stiff from sitting in the old chair. You walked to the center of the unit and looked around one last time, at the walls, the floor, the chair, the empty space where the fortune had been. You thought about everything that had happened since you had first pushed open that rusted iron door. The ledger. The T names. The photograph of the woman outside the bank. The list of 17 names. The flight to San Francisco. The old woman in Chinatown. The iron box of unmailed letters. The child's drawing of a crooked boat. The photograph from the fishing village in Fujian. All of it, now, was complete. You turned off the lamp. The darkness Russ. Head back in, filling every corner, every crevice, every place the light had touched. You stood in it for a long moment, letting it settle around you like a blanket. Then you walked to the door, your footsteps echoing softly on the bare concrete. You paused at the threshold, one hand resting on the cold metal frame, and looked back over your shoulder. You could see nothing. The darkness was absolute. But you knew everything was still there. The chair. The crate. The smell of cedar. The memory of all those nights, all those years, all those names. You stepped through the door and pulled it down behind you. The tracks gave a low, grinding groan as the corrugated metal descended, and then the lock clicked shut with a sound that was final but not sad. The rain was still falling, steady and patient, as it had been falling on and off since the day you first received the letter from the lawyer in Portland. You put the key back in your pocket, the brass warm against your palm, the tag with its fading numbers pressed gently against your thigh, and walked to your car, the gravel crunching beneath your feet. The floodlight cast its pale orange glow across the wet asphalt, and the bare trees swayed gently in the wind off the sea. It was time to go home. The drive home was quiet. The road unwound before you in the darkness, a narrow ribbon of wet asphalt winding through the bare black trees. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm now, neither hard nor soft, just constant, the kind of rain that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Your headlights swept across the gravel track, the chain-link gate, the empty parking lot of the storage facility, and then you were on the main road, and the facility was shrinking in your rearview mirror. You did not drive fast. There was no reason to. The night was deep and still, and the world beyond the reach of your headlights was a soft, blurred watercolor of gray and black. The windshield wipers kept their steady time, pushing the rain aside in smooth, rhythmic arcs. Thump. 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 Like a heartbeat made of rubber and glass. You kept the radio off. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the hiss of the tires on the wet road, and the rain on the roof. In your pocket, the key rested against your thigh. The brass had long since warmed to your body temperature, but you were still aware of its weight, its solid, reassuring presence. The iron tag with its fading numbers pressed gently against the fabric of your coat. You had touched that tag so many times now that the raised edges of the digits had begun to wear smooth. 1931, soon, you knew, it would be barely legible. But you did not need to read it anymore. You knew what it meant. You thought about your uncle. Not the uncle of your childhood, the vague, distant figure who appeared in holiday stories and then faded from memory. The real man. The one you had come to know through his journals and his letters and the quiet, careful records he had kept in his ledger. The one who had stood on the deck of a cargo ship with the salt wind in his face, watching the lights of San Francisco rise out of the fog. The one who had sat in that old rattan chair, night after night, listening to the rain on the iron roof. The one who had carried the weight of 17 names for more than half a century, and who had never stopped trying to make good on the promises he had made. You thought about the photograph from the fishing village in Fujian. The young woman in her high-collared jacket, holding her child, staring into the camera with eyes that had waited 50 years for an answer. You thought about the note on the back of the photograph, written in a hand that had pressed so hard the letters had nearly torn through the paper. Thank you for telling us that he never forgot the way home. You had not told them, not really. Your uncle had told them. You had only been the messenger. The last link in a chain that had stretched across an ocean and nearly a century. The highway gave way to the familiar streets of your town. The street lamps cast their amber halos on the wet pavement. The houses you passed were dark, their windows blank, their occupants asleep. You pulled into your driveway and turned off the engine. For a long moment, you simply sat there, listening to the rain on the roof of the car, feeling the warmth of the key in your pocket. Inside, the house was quiet. You did not turn on the lights. You walked through the dark rooms by memory, your hand brushing the familiar edges of furniture and door frames, until you reached your study. The ledger was on the shelf where you had left it. The journals were beside it. The photograph from the fishing village was tucked into the pages of the ledger, beside the photograph of the young woman outside the Bank of Italy. Violet and the fisherman's wife. Two women who had waited. Two promises that had finally been kept. You pulled the key from your pocket and set it on the desk. The brass caught the faint glow of the street lamp outside, its surface worn smooth, its tag almost blank. You looked at it for a long moment. 1931, the year the Great Depression was at its worst. The year your uncle had begun keeping his ledger. The year the first shipment of Dragon Well had crossed the Pacific. It was not just a number anymore. It was a chapter heading. A title page. An entrance to a story that was now complete. The rain continues outside. It has been falling for so long now that it feels like part of the room, part of the story, part of you. Perhaps, on some other rainy night, you will take out the key again. You will hold it up to the lamplight and watch the brass catch the glow. You will turn the tag over in your fingers and feel the faint, fading impression of the numbers. And you will remember. Not the money. Not the secrets. The promise. The weight of a promise that was finally, after all these years, fulfilled. You left the key on the desk and walked to your bedroom. The rain was still falling, steady and patient, as it had been falling on and off since the day you first received the letter from the lawyer in Portland. You lay down on the bed and closed your eyes. The story was over. The door was closed. But the rain remained. And that was all right. That was how it was meant to be. Good night.